Welcome back. This is part 2 of the EXP Expo Day 1. We are here joined by comic book legend, cult figure, leader of men, Howard Chaykin. One of my favorite writers, one of my favorite creators ever. And we're going to talk about why here in just a minute. Welcome in, Howard. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. I'm grateful for the attention because I'm always looking to mistake it for affection. Why not?
So you've discussed it many times, but I just want, for people who are joining us today, who are maybe seeing you for the first time, why comics?
I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Why did you choose to work in this field? You're incredibly.
There was no choice involved. I mean, comics has more in common with the Jesuitry than any other form of commercial art and commercial performance. I first saw comics when I was 4 years old. I was given a refrigerator-sized box half filled with comic books of all genres. I was 4. It was the summer of 1955, and I can still bring up the sense memory of the smell of that paper. And within a year's time, I was able to read on the 4th grade level because of comic books. My parents, who were morons, mistook this as some sort of anomalous genetic change in me, that I had some sort of superpower. They never realized that it was comic books that had taught me to read. And at that point, I mean, I'm a fairly smart guy, easy to dislike, but smart nonetheless. And I realized that that there was someone who made these things. They were a craft work, and that I wanted to be one of those people. And I've never wanted anything else as much as I wanted that. That was the prima facie of my life. It was everything I ever wanted to do and be. Now, it's not like I had any talent per se. That is not what we're talking about here. Talent is, as you know, to paraphrase Nietzsche, talent is conviction. It's what you make of what you've got. And I had blind rage, terror, and fear. And I translated those into a desire to be. And I discovered that, I was willing to work really hard at only one thing, and that was this. I let the rest of my life go by the wayside. I come from a really dysfunctional family. And one of the means in which I dealt with that dysfunction was to bury my head in comics. And comics saved my life in every way, shape, and form. I've been a working professional for over 50 years now. And I'm lucky enough to be a member of a generation whose lives were intertwined with the guys who created the form in which we work. That they're not just legends lost to time and recollection and memory, that they were real people that I spent time with. I stand on the shoulders of giants, as I've said more than once, on Gil Kane, Wallace Wood, Neil Adams, Gray Morrow, and Joe Orlando, who rabbied me at DC Comics, who saved my bacon in terms of making my way navigating through the business halls of DC Comics, which were run by Carmine Infantino, who despised Gil Kane. They'd hated each other since the 1940s when they met his children. And I was associated with Gil by being his assistant and basically, agreeing with much of what Gil said and did. Not so much did, but said. And it was Orlando who saved my ass at the company, making it possible for me to work up there. I'm very grateful for that. So I'm a comics man. I mean, comics is a calling. I have a distinct and innate mistrust of people who say to me that he came to comics as a player in a field which you have no right to claim your own. Comics I've often described as a frivolous medium, difficult to do well, and I stand by that.
It's interesting that you say that it's a difficult medium that's interesting to do well. We've talked to several people today who have talked about how they've taken comics, they've started in comics, and they've transitioned into other things. I know you worked in television. We spoke to Bob Layton earlier, who's working in, film now, writing films and doing that kind of thing.
Does he actually get produced?
He has his own production company. They're on hiatus because of the pandemic, but they've got a movie that's ready to go with an A-lister who's going to star in it, and just waiting for things to open back up so they can finish the project. But I think it's interesting, and maybe you can speak to it, that comic people can go into other things and be very successful, but it's very hard for people to come from other things into comics and be successful.
I don't think either of those are particularly true. I think that comics has become, certainly over the past 25 years, thanks mostly to Stan Lee as a figurehead of the marketplace, a writer's medium, which is absurd. Comics is populated with hundreds of professional writers who haven't got a clue about how to tell a story visually, and an audience that has been infantilized and educationally diminished by the life experience they've had, who read comics as if it was literature as opposed to the junk that it is. And comics is I did not work in television because I wanted to work in television. I should explain. I did this because I had to. I mean, I had an epiphany between the time I was 34 and until the day I turned 35, that I had no prospects, and that as good as I am in comics, I know how good I am. This is not self-deprecation. I also recognize the fact that, as you said earlier, I'm a cult figure, and that cult figure does not translate into an easy retirement and an easy life. Comic books is filled with people who think that the heat they've got in this moment of time is going to last forever. I speak from personal experience as a member of the board of the Hero Initiative. I made a conscious and an educated decision to move to California the day before I turned 35 to take advantage of what little attention I had achieved from the first major success I had as a professional, which is American Flag in 1983, which is not a huge commercial success by any means. It was a success d'estime, in which I garnered some attention in Hollywood. I got an agent, and that turned into a television career. I spent 12 and a half years working on staff in a business that is not a freelancing business. And what the result of that was that I have a pension, I have real estate, and I have a life. And because at 35, I realized that I had no prospects whatsoever, that I didn't know how to get health care. I didn't know what life would be like should I get this old. And I did get this old, and I'm this old and happily in this old person's body because of the choices I made. But had I been able to achieve the kind of commercial and financial success that television gave me, the house at the beach, which I own outright without a mortgage, and an income and a lifestyle that makes it possible for me to live and eat, I would never have left comics. But comics is not there for me in that regard. I'm not a commercial figure. The way you become a successful commercial figure in comics, for the most part, I'm talking about mainstream comics, not talking about graphic novels or all that art school crap. I'm talking about mainstream street-level material. The way you achieve success in that frequently is to identify and associate yourself with a character that is either moribund, that part of the audience wants to see more of, or a character that has already existed, and you become part of that train. And I never did that because I'm just not that interested in that. I was a superhero comic book fanatic as a little boy, and within days of my becoming a working professional, my interest in that material vanished entirely. And I'm appalled at the number of my colleagues who still read superhero comic books for entertainment. What the hell are you thinking? I love the comics medium. I'm not particularly interested in the content of the material as the mainstream lays it out, which my career has demonstrated. I mean, I've taken advantage of the fact that I don't need the attention and approbation of an audience that is institutionalized in its gatekeeping, to do whatever I damn well please. And and I have not, I mean, I'm bitter. Understand, I'm not thrilled about the reality that I'm not accepted as a part of the bulwark of the mainstream. But on the other hand, it gives me enormous freedom. It means I don't have to do the same Batman nonsense every day of my life. It means I don't have to associate myself with adolescent power fantasy junk for which I have contempt. I mean, I'm certainly capable of producing that material, but only as a journeyman. And again, I've often said that I bring the same level of effort to doing work for a corporate enterprise as I do for myself, because the work deserves it. But let's face it. I mean, I'm just not that interested in stories about people with stuff coming out of their eyes or their fingertips. It just doesn't interest me very much.
Well, and I want to talk about some of that stuff that you mentioned about the not superhero stuff that you've done. But I wanted to first ask you, 18 years old, you started working with Gil Kane, who for so many of us was, and for so many in the industry was kind of this high water mark to learn from. What was that like?
Well, I met Gil when I was 13. I was selling books that I'd stolen from a friend of mine at a used bookstore. And Gil was in this bookstore looking for Will James books. Will James was a children's book writer and illustrator whose horses were just gorgeous. And Gil learned a great deal by drawing horses for his Western stuff from Will James. I then went to work for him 5 years later because his assistant had died in his sleep. And I went to work for him, and I had no talent or skills. I mean, he told me he dismissed my work as junk, out of hand. But what I didn't know, because I didn't have a broad historical perspective, was that his career arc was very similar to mine. He also started just awful. He had no skills at all, but he had hunger and rage. And he was better than I was when he started. I mean, let me say here and now that he could at least put a page together. I could not. But the experience taught me a valuable lesson, in that lesson being how to get up in the morning, sit down at your desk, and do your job, whether you feel like it or not. The experience I had in those first couple of years of working with Gil Kane and then working with Wallace Wood told me that I was terrified that I ended up like Wallace Wood, but I really wanted to end up like Gil Kane. Now, Gil was a very complicated and contradictory figure. He really was. He is as guilty of everything that he's been accused of in terms of gonifdom as he is. He truly was. He stole artwork and all that stuff. I mean, there's no question there. It happened. It was real. And his self-justifications are absurd. But I miss him terribly. I truly do. I realize when I open my mouth onto a regular occasion, what I've learned from him and what I've absorbed from him remains a part of my thinking. Anecdotally, it's worth noting that as good an essayist he was, as a good thinker as he was, he couldn't write comics worth a damn. His writing was terrible, just awful. It was pretentious, it was pedantic, it was prolix, and just a mess. And that's true of most of my mentors. I mean, I can't think of anybody I worked for or with who could write worth a damn. And that's what separates me from that pack. I'm as good a writer as I am an artist. And in a marketplace that identifies the writer as the alpha in comics, being able to write and draw my own stuff would seem to be an advantage, but it's really not. Because the perception is left that if I can write this well, why would I bother drawing it? That sort of thing. And that really is the reality of my experience. So yeah, working with Gil Kane was a constant lesson. It lasted about a year. I think he died owing me $50. And I cherish those memories. It was just an astonishing time in my life.
It's interesting.
To a certain extent, I memorialize it in the latter part of the second arc of Hey Kids Comics.
And I want to talk to you about Hey Kids Comics, but it's interesting what Bob Layton said that Dick Giordano taught him, and what you were talking about with what Gil taught you are incredibly the same. Not treating this as a hobby, treating this as a job. Get up every day, do your work. Strive to be better, things like that. I think it speaks a lot to that generation of Dick and Gil, that they treat it as a job, and so many people today treat it as a hobby that's also their job.
Well, I mean, I did a seminar at Marvel Comics for 6 years. And in the course of that seminar, it was a 3-day workshop where they would bring in 5 guys who they had under contract back in the days when they were contract, who they felt were not producing work up to the level of the money they were investing in them. And my job was the first day of that 3-day seminar was beating the hobbyism out of them. Now, I have a reputation for being a contrarian, a reasonably outspoken, not particularly corporately connected character. Okay, so these guys were flabbergasted when I explained to them that since you're no longer drawing comics for yourself on your mother's cutting board in the dining room in the middle of the night where everyone else is sleeping, you're taking money for this work, you are now a corporate cog, whether you like it or not. You're not putting anything over on the man by behaving in an unprofessional and amateurish way. What you're doing is you're feeding into the corporate control of your life and confirming all the worst suspicions about you as an artist. A contributing factor to why writers are the alphas in comics is that for the most part, they're smarter than artists. Artists are stupid enough to think they're putting something over on the world by behaving like amateur dickheads. And that amateurism, that hobbyism diminishes and hampers the power wielded by the true alpha as opposed to the writer alpha in the comic book business.
So I want to talk about your writing, and I want to give you, a cheap plug for you. We did an interview earlier this week with Nick, but you talked about your writing on Substack. And I immediately went over and subscribed. And I've been reading it every day, trying to go back as far as I could and just reading one article a day on there. And your writing is of a level that the writer artists we see. There are very few who do it well, but your writing is of a level that's equal to your art, and it's very impressive. So which would you call if you had to pick one, would you call yourself a writer, or would you call yourself an artist, or do you just call yourself a creator?
I'm a cartoonist, and I'm a cartoonist, which means that I write and draw my own stuff, and that even when I'm drawing a story from another writer, I'm still participating in the writing in the sense that I'm the delivery system for a template. The Substack material is an extensive series of opinion pieces, which are part and parcel to the point of view expressed in my comic stuff, but they're there as much as anything else to confirm everybody's worst suspicions of those who've actually paid attention to the work that I've done. The misperception of who I am in the context of comics is both alarming and saddening. I've said this more than once, and I'll be writing a piece about this next week, that the woke left regards people like me as a dangerous adversary to be crushed and canceled, whereas the Nazi right regards me as a potential ally because I've been offended by the woke left. Please. They're both idiots. The ineptitude on both sides is shocking to me. I'm not a centrist by any means, but I'm certainly not an authoritarian wokist or a totalitarian rightist. The work shows that in every way, shape, and form.
Absolutely. And that's something I wanted to ask about is you have for years, and you can see it in a lot of your creator-owned work, things like Black Kiss and Divided States of Hysteria. You've never shied away from a topic that would make people uncomfortable. And I think that is, I don't want to say this in a way that feels like I'm blowing smoke at you, but I think that's rivaled by very few in the industry of having that lack of fear. I think Will Eisner had it in the way he presented New York. I think Harvey Pekar had it in looking at the way he looked at the world. I think you have a very unique lens through which you look at things, and you express that through this medium. Do you think comics should be a means for that kind of dialogue?
I have an aversion to the word should. I think the word can is more likely appropriate.
Okay.
I accept the fact. I'm embarrassed by the fact that it took me so many years to understand the reality that when the Comics Code Authority came along and infantilized comics, it also infantilized the audience. It drove away an entire swath of the audience that might be interested in something other than in teenage junks, funny animals, and superheroes. And those people came back in the early 60s with the undergrounds, but significantly, very few people came back with in the mainstream producing genre material as opposed that wasn't simply outrageous humor based. It's heavily influenced by Kurtzman's Mad, but not very influenced by Kurtzman's Two-Fisted Tales of Frontline Combat or Johnny Craig's Crime Suspense or Shock Suspense, the liberal hysteria comics. And I'm influenced by all of that stuff to a profound degree. And I have an aversion to the maudlin. I have an aversion to the treacly. And which is one of the reasons why, as much as I love the spirit stuff that, in Eisner's early years, I find his later work condescending and treacly and just bullshit in no uncertain terms. The reality is that the comic book audience tends to embrace a self-congratulation and a smugness. I think in retrospect, one of the reasons why I think that I'm as marginalized as I am is that I'm looking at a comic book business and an industry that regards adversaries and antagonists with as if they are, quote, villains. The Joker, Luther, these mustache twirling melodramatic throwbacks to the 19th century, stage drama. Whereas actual villains look very much like normal people and heroes and just behave that way. And that in real life, the actual antagonists we have, earnestly and honestly, I believe, beyond nihilism and cynicism, we can believe they are operating from a perspective of enlightened interest, self or otherwise. And that the anodyne nature of comic books, the institutionalized gatekeeping that sets the series of bullet points of acceptability in mainstream comics is absurd. I mean, and let's face it, Batman at its core is about a rich guy who had a bad day when he was 8, and his life is perceived through the scrim of a 15-year-old boy's idea of how such a thing would traumatize an adult. And I don't know a lot of 15-year-old boys who have any real idea of what actual adult trauma looks or feels like. By the same token, if you accept the Superman myth as a parallel of Jesus or Moses, the arrival of God on Earth is not going to be an era of well-being for the rest of us. You can tell me all you want about Mom and Pa Kent inculcating American values into young Kal-El, but the truth of the matter is, once power is manifested, power manifests itself. That's just the reality. So comic books are based on a self-reflective series of lies that the audience wants to believe and rejects material that rejects those belief systems. And it's one of the reasons why I tend to do genre material, westerns, crime stories, war stories, in which the clear-cut nature of good and evil does not exist. I reject it out of hand. But again, I recognize the fact that having made that choice, I'm working in the wrong business.
So something that makes me kind of unique amongst my comic book peers and friends is that I read a lot of stuff way too young. I was the kid I wasn't 10 years old and I was reading Preacher. So I discovered the undergrounds or the early indies much younger than many people I know did. So I was reading Will Eisner's original Spirit run, in my teens. I was reading your work with Howard Chaykin on the Spirit in my mid-teens, or on the Shadow. I'm sorry. I was reading, Harvey Pekar, American Splendor in my teens, and a lot of these genre books, as you call them, as rightfully so. So I've always been fascinated by that type of storytelling. Where do you? They say comedy is tragedy plus time, and I think that the storytelling in comic books has a similar formulation, that it's you perceive it, you see it happen, and then you process it as a writer or creator. and are able to tell the stories that people are actually experiencing, real cities, real places, real times. Your shadow really does reflect the true nature of New York at a time in New York, before it became Disneyland. So what what do you think that is? What does that look like from when you have an idea or you see something that you want to tell a story about to actually putting it on a page?
Well, I don't I'd never ever consider the audience. I used to. When I mean I did flag after being away from comics for about 2 years. And I spent 6 months revving up for the experience, looking at what was being looked at commercially, and I went and did what I did. And the reality is, I don't have any interest whatsoever in screened memory or secondhand opinion. Um, I I like darkly comic narratives with self-aware characters who, may not be realistic. I mean, verisimilitude and realism are very different things. Comics is not a medium that lends itself to, at least from my perspective and with my toolkit and my skill set, to deeply realistic material. But I can at least convey an atmosphere, a theme, um, um, uh, a, a, a set of narratives that feels realer than what I grew up reading. Um, I just cannot become deeply enthused about the sort of thing that the rest of the audience is deeply enthused about. I don't share the sensibilities of my audience, and it saddens me because I'd like to have a bigger footprint. You know, I often dismiss the first 10 years of my work, and people mistake that for just self-deprecation. And one of the reasons that work is so popular is because it's associated with a brand that is incredibly popular. That years ago when John Lennon said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, he should have taken a look at the fact and noted that in a couple of years' time, Star Wars would come along, and that would be bigger than Jesus. Um, Star Wars has become a cultural touchstone in the religion, and the reason that the work that I did in that book is so well received is because of the branding of the material, not of my work. The audience in comics has been convinced of the value of the material as opposed to the talent producing the material, which is sad. It really is, because basically these aren't really characters as much as empty vessels and plot devices who are at the mercy of the talent producing them. So I do whatever I damn well please and hope for the best. I'm, I don't feel the particular call to finding out what the audience who's reading this or that superhero comic book cares about, because it's not something I can address. It's not something I can answer with any real conviction.
Sure.
I mean, I if I do mainstream superhero comics, my job is to avoid appearing parodistic, but to convey at least some sort of responsibility to the corporation that owns that material for the sake of the time in which I spend on the material. Does that make sense?
It does. I just froze, didn't I? It totally makes sense. And that's, I want to,
You disappeared from me audibly.
yeah, I muted my mic so I could cough and forgot to unmute it.
It's going to be that. I want to hear that racking, wretched cough. I want to know that there's tuberculosis has not left us as a culture. Tuberculosis has not left us as a culture.
It has.
He's a longer.
It's true. No, so I've been working towards it kind of in the way I've been thinking about this. Hey Kids Comics is kind of an unabashed look at the reality of the comic book industry.
Well, it's a subjective reality. Understand? It's completely subjective.
Well, it's heavily informed by the reality that you have lived.
Well, I've often said that a lot of it didn't happen, but it's all true. I stand by that. I mean,
So
when I was
go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say there's one volume out. Tell people what that was about.
Well, interestingly, the year before I did it, I put out a request for people with anecdotes, and every single thing I got from everybody was a settling of scores, which I really resented because it was the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to do what was basically a somewhat toxic love letter to the business that has given me my life. It's filled with avatars, some of whom are very directly related to real people, some of whom are combinations and conflations. And it was an absolute pleasure to do. It truly was. The second arc is called Profits and Loss, and it'll start coming out this spring. It's finished. It's completely done, all 6 issues. It's somewhat more linear than the first arc. It covers the 30-year period with a couple of little sidebars. And it continues the characters we've met. It introduces a new set of characters from that period, and also 2 more generations, and a taste and a whiff of the third following that. Those who've read it have said that it's a little less bitter than the first arc, but thematically speaking, what underpins that first arc, those 5 issues, is a story of people who came back from the war, who were looking for somebody to tide them over while they found something to do with their lives. And they woke up at 60 and 70 and found they'd been doing the tiding over thing for 50 years. And discovered that the work that they had dismissed as irrelevant and valueless had made billions for other people. And there's a lot to be bitter in that regard.
I loved it because to me you see a lot of these books about the comic industry, and it's how to draw comics the Marvel way and how to write like so and so and how to do this. But this felt real to me. Knowing how many artists and creators I know, this felt like it had a lot of that realism that I thought was really refreshing in a book, telling stories about the industry.
Well, I mean, I have to tell you that, like a lot of my stuff, my primary readership in this book was fellow professionals. People read this book and were nodded their head in agreement. And they knew where it was coming. I'll be curious to see what happens with the second arc, because that's also filled with avatars, many of whom are of people who are actually still alive. So there's a possibility that when and if the convention business becomes an in-person experience again, I may get my ass kicked. It's very
Well, it's somebody once told me that if they're not willing to kick your ass for doing it, it's not worth doing. So
tell that you're working in comics because these people are kissing ass as opposed to kicking ass.
Well, that guy was in the punk rock business, so he might have had a little bit of a agenda.
Okay.
So let me ask you about this. Hey Kids Comics, and a lot of your stuff in recent history has come out from Image Comics. How did that relationship start?
They had been. I've been hearing for years some people wanting to do a sequel to Black Kiss, and I could not figure out what that sequel would be. And Image came to me, and concurrent with that, I was reading a book called Finishing the Hat, which is the first of 2 volumes of Stephen Sondheim annotating his own lyrics and talking about his own life. And in the course of the book, he discusses at some length the first act closer from Follies, which is probably my favorite Sondheim show, sung by an actress named Carlotta. The song is called I'm Still Here. And in his annotation, he talks about that it's a deeply fictionalized version of Joan Crawford's career. And the light went on. So I ended up doing a prequel, and it was a real learning curve experience for me. I like working at Image. Image is not the company that was in the 90s. It's an entirely different firm. And it's been a very good working experience. I'm very happy. They published Black Kiss. They published Midnight of the Soul, my collaboration with Matt Fraction, Satellite Sam, and most recently, Hey Kids Comics. They'll be publishing other stuff of mine from my creator-owned backlog over the next year or so. We've got the next arc of Hey Kids Comics, as I said, plus then the final volume of the Times Square trilogy, which I started in the 80s, and which I finished this past year. The third volume is called Hallowed Ground Zero, and it completes the trilogy, and I'm assuming we're going to be publishing it in a single big fat volume. So it's a good experience. And I've worked for other people at the same time, but Image is my primary client at this stage.
I want to ask very specifically about Satellite Sam.
Okay.
Because Matt Fraction is one of my favorite people going.
Okay.
But I'm going to come back to that. I want to ask you about Stephen Sondheim.
Okay.
I should have known, having read.
Sondheim loves being regarded as someone who inspired me to do a filthy pornographic comic book.
Well, I think Stephen Sondheim would be a fan for sure.
I don't know. Fraction pointed out after seeing that Frank Rich documentary about Sondheim that he was like my older brother. I thought it was fun.
My favorite Sondheim show is Assassins, and anybody who can get inside the mind of people who want to kill presidents is someone that I can be a fan of. And I like people who have a very unique point of view, and Sondheim certainly has one. And so that was what I was going to ask you: is who else? Sondheim influenced that volume of Black Kiss. Who else are some of your influences that you can look at directly at some of your work and say, hey, this is what I was consuming at the time that inspired me to do this thing?
Well, in the same vein as Sondheim, Frank Lesser, who is a guy who did Guys and Dolls, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, and Most Happy Fella, who I believe one of the things I learned from Sondheim is that he feels as I do that Lesser was one of the, if not the greatest, vernacular American speech in the American songbook, and a lot of crime fiction, not much science fiction because I sort of got weaned away from science fiction in the mid-'70s. Van Morrison, the band, both of which are narrative music, and I really respond to that. As an artist, I'm deeply influenced by everybody from Alex Toth to John Severin to Wallace Wood to Johnny Craig. I look at everything, and I collect American illustration. I'm sitting here in my office right now, and if I point in that direction, there's a Conti crayon drawing by Dean Cornwell from the illustration from the part of the mural that's in the Eastern Airlines mural in Rockefeller Center, number 8 Rockefeller Plaza. When and if this is over, go to New York, visit that. If I point in that direction, over my fireplace, there's an illustration by Robert Fawcett for Hickory Dickory Death, an Agatha Christie novel featuring Hercule Poirot. If I point at that, where is it? It's over there. There it is, right there up on the wall. There's a painting by Robert Fawcett as well for the art director, which is a legendary piece. So I'm looking at this stuff every day and all the time. Behind me, if I go this direction, you can see the Frank King book, Walt and Skeezix, Sundays with Walt and Skeezix. So I don't look at the stuff that looks like my stuff. I look at everything, and I'm available. It's just when I came into the business. I mean, I'm born in '50. I became a professional in late '70. My generation read everything and saw everything. We read for entertainment. We were all science fiction and fantasy fans. We'd always all grown up reading Edgar Rice Burroughs and Conan. Some of us had been turned on to the crime fiction, to the Hammett and Chandler stuff, H.P. Lovecraft, A. Merritt, all this stuff. and we went to the same movies. I was talking to my wife yesterday about the fact that when I was in my teens and 20s, I never went on dates to movies. Certainly not the first time. Dates were dinner dates. I saw most of the movies I saw from my teens into my 20s with colleagues because we went to the movies in groups. And, we're in the Lockdown Film Festival, which is the subjective Howard Chaykin Festival. My wife has never seen movies. She was not a moviegoer when she was younger. So she's seeing stuff for the first time. And I showed her Where Eagles Dare last night, which I had no memory of it whatsoever because it just kept not ending. It's relentless. And I pointed out that I'd seen the movie in its first run, probably with Simonson, in a local movie theater when we took the day off and decided not to work that day when we were kids, 25 or whatever, how old we were. And that stuff informs it enormously. I did a podcast a couple of days ago where we discussed movies, and I was asked to come up with 2 movies that I wanted to see. One I really loved and one that had problems, and I did. And the age range of the group everybody was at least 10 years my junior, in some cases half my age. And it was fascinating watching this one young guy, who's probably in his late 30s, go out of his way not to tell me the truth, how much he hated both these movies. He just loathed them. It was obvious. He was trying to be nice, find something nice to say about these movies. And the things he didn't like about the movie are the very things that I loved about the movie. That you had to pay attention to dialogue, that there was nuance in character, that they were about characters, that they weren't about action sequences in which people behaved as if they had character but really didn't. I came to realize when I watched a couple of episodes of the X-Files that the reason that X-Files was so popular was that David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, an actress who I come to really admire, delivered as empty a set of performances as they possibly could that were informed by the audience's assumptions and presumptions about character. And that's sort of how I feel about Batman and most superhero comic books. That they're not really characters but plot devices that are used by writers and artists to sort of move it along. One big endless train, a carnival train. And I'm just not that interested.
What were the movies?
Which movies? What are you talking about?
The ones that you listed on the podcast.
Oh, His Girl Friday and Nothing Sacred. I'm sorry, My Man Godfrey and Nothing Sacred.
All right, I know Nothing Sacred. I've not seen My Man Godfrey. It's going on my list for tonight.
Godfrey is a 1936 picture directed by Gregory LaCava, starring William Powell and Carol Lombard. And it's a movie about the rich meeting the poor, and it's a great Carol Lombard performance. She's fantastic, as is Powell. And my issues with the second film, with Nothing Sacred, is that I love the movie, but it's brought down by its male lead, who is Frederick March, who is a lox in this movie. He sucks the life out of the movie by showing up in it. I realized that it wasn't just that movie. Like we watched about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, we watched I Married a Witch, which co-starred Frederick March with Veronica Lake, which was much of the inspiration of Bewitched. And I'm watching the movie and realizing that the studio must have really wished that Carol Lombard was still alive to play the Veronica Lake part, and that somebody else should have played the Frederick March part as well. Both films share Charles Winninger, who plays a witch, a warlock in I Married a Witch, and a Vermont country doctor who's too drunk to notice that his diagnosis is wrong in Nothing Sacred. Both pictures are worth seeing now.
So I'm definitely putting My Man Godfrey on my list for tonight. But
don't see the remake. Don't see the remake. Remake is awful.
No.
Oh. It's got June Allison, which is like Radioactivity.
So I want to talk to you about working with Matt Fraction. I don't know for sure that Satellite Sam was what introduced me to Matt, but it had to be one of the first few things I had read that he worked on. What was that collaboration like? Because he's one of the wildest guys out there, man. Some of his ideas are just so far off the wall.
I don't think Matt is wild. I think he's like a nice Midwestern boy.
He's certainly one of the most creative people working in terms of he can pull a story from nowhere.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the nice things about Matt is that Matt has always referred to Satellite Sam as Howard Chaykin fan fiction, which I find very amusing. We both had read the same book. there's a book called Hey Kids, What Time Is It? Which is backstage of the Howdy Doody show. And it was a huge influence on what we did in Satellite Sam. We spent a weekend wandering around New York City, just looking at stations across of my life. And spent some time watching children's television, science fiction television made for kids at the Paley Center. And did some serious bonding. And the result of that was Satellite Sam. And the nice thing the great thing for me about Satellite Sam was an opportunity to do so elaborate an enterprise in black and white, and to create a black and white universe in comics, different in its own way from Black Kiss in that regard, but of its own.
Certainly. Do you like that method for collaboration, that really getting to know somebody and spending a lot of time with them? Do you think a result is a better product when you do that?
Not necessarily. No, not really. It should be made clear that I did that. What you saw visually in Satellite Sam was not a transliteration of what the script said. Okay, I told Matt's story, but I did not always follow, or even often follow, his shot call. There are very few writers whose work I will approach with the idea that what's called for is what's going to come up literally. It's kind of artist friendliness, and my job is not to take a comic book script, and illustrate it. My job is to take a comic book script and find the visual equivalent of that textual narrative. I published a piece about writing in comics that goes directly to the idea of just how much responsibility the artist has to the text and the narrative. And one of the things that one of the contributing factors of why the writer is the alpha in comics today is that comics have now been finally successfully perceived and identified as source material for ancillary product for movies and television. And they're misperceived by the people who are buying them as storyboards, and that they are misperceived as stories in which comic book artists illustrate them and support the narrative text. And the reason for that is that in many cases, among other reasons, is that the people who are buying the material, the managers and the representation class, can identify the skill set required to write. They may not be able to write themselves, but they can write. They know how to use a keyboard, and they can put a text together of some sort. But the idea of drawing something is shamanistic. It's an alien experience. It's an other's enterprise. And the proprietary nature of many writers in their relationship with the artists with whom they collaborate is frequently insulting and condescending. If someone ever again refers to me as their artist, I will do what Mao suggests and reach for my gun. The writing in comics is a 50-50 relationship between the writer and the artist.
I like to refer to it as collaboration.
Most comic book writers are a lot smarter than comic book artists, and comic book artists contribute to their second-class citizenship by behaving like amateur assholes.
So we're running short on time. We got a few minutes left here.
I have a nap coming up, so I'm good.
Yeah, it's been a long day for me as well. I could use one, but let me ask you this:
You're approaching dinner time. I haven't even had lunch yet.
I forgoed my lunch to talk to Scott Hanna today, so that was fun. I'm about to have lunch my own self.
What are you having?
There's a great deli near me. The man who founded it was drafted by the New York Giants back in the 70s and blew his knee out like his second day in practice. But he had a 6-month lease on an apartment in New York. So he lived there that time, and he fell in love with a deli.
Mm-hmm.
And he came back and opened a bodega-style deli in Toledo, Ohio.
What could be bad? Whoa!
Right. I go there 3 times a week at least, and get a nice big sandwich. And they're all named for streets in Manhattan. And all the sides are named for different neighborhoods and the different boroughs. And
Love this.
yeah, it's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite places. And I was going to ask you about that. That was going to be my last question, but we'll jump ahead to that. You are a notorious food lover.
I'm a fat slob. It's true.
And I'm supposed to ask in these words, ask Howard about taking the goy to the Jewish deli. That's from Bob Layton.
I've never eaten with Bob in a restaurant in my life. It's in my memory. I don't recall.
He said you introduced him to matzo ball soup.
I have no recollection of that whatsoever. I find that unlikely. It's like something Bob made up. I took Walter Simon to do his kosher delicatessen, and that was a pisser. But we were much younger then, But I live in a small town in Southern California. I live about an hour and a half north of Los Angeles, and one of the things that I've had to do is unlearn eating habits of New York City. I've been away from New York for 35 years. I moved here on October the 6th, 1985, so it's been 35 years. And I miss the dining experience of New York City. Look, one of the results of the lockdown is that I don't have breakfast with colleagues every morning. I usually eat with a bunch of rancorous contrarians who hate everything and everybody, and it's a really good way to start the day. And I miss the experience of being on an airplane every 2 weeks and going to other people's places and eating other people's food. My last trip was in New York in February. There's a photograph circulating on Facebook of me and Michael Kaluta looking like Old Testament prophets. And, that was a week of just absolutely fabulous chowing down, baby. We were at Bond 45, which is one of my favorite Italian restaurants in New York City. We were at the Smith, which is a terrific joint up on 63rd Street and Broadway. And, just all over town. And I miss it terribly. I truly do. One of the things that's happened in the lockdown is that my wife and I are cooking a lot. And I do a lot of the cooking so I can control the environment because I'm a control freak when it comes to this stuff. And my skill set, which is always pretty high, has really been enhanced. Just before I came on with you, my question to her was, do you want to have the leftover barbecue we had, a deep dish pizza, or pork chop cacciatore? The two things are easy to make. The cacciatore requires some skill and attention. I may do the cacciatore tomorrow, that kind of thing. So, but I do miss it terribly. I truly do. But when I think of Toledo, all I can think of is Uncle Tanus.
Hey, what's weird about Toledo is you got Hungarian and Polish food fusion. It's everybody thinks about the Tony Packo's hot dogs from Jamie Farr and MASH, and they're great. But we've got these restaurants where it's, we've got a restaurant here called the Budapest that's Hungarian food mixed with Turkish food mixed with.
That sounds fantastic.
It's one of my favorite. I'm talking to you about it. My mouth's starting to water.
I know. Believe me, I know the experience. I'm going to recommend a book to you. I'm going to recommend a book called Alice, Let's Eat by Calvin Trillin, who talks about his experiences of eating on the road. And Trillin is the guy who got me, who convinced me that when I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, I don't want to eat in the best French restaurant in Cincinnati, Ohio. I want a chili size. You
need your Skyline chili, and you come to Cincinnati, Ohio. You go to the Montgomery Inn, get your little barbecue and some Skyline chili, and you're happy. You come to Columbus, Ohio, you get yourself a White Castle slider, and we move on with life. I'm
there. I'm telling you, man. Look, one of my favorite things about traveling around the country is going to Savannah and working my way through the restaurants in Savannah, Georgia. And there's an ice cream parlor on Main Street in Savannah that's owned and run by a guy who was a movie producer whose grandfather and great uncle had an ice cream parlor back in the 20s and 30s, and he's reinvented it. Holy God, it's fantastic. I mean,
Right.
it's the butterfat hardening your arteries when you bite into that butter pecan, baby. You know,
It's one of the great joys I have in doing what I'm doing now is that I'm traveling and visiting comic shops, and so I get to go into these comic shops, which is great. But then I get to, go, where do I need to eat? And they'll be like, oh, well, there's a hot dog vendor around the corner 2 blocks down.
works for
All
me.
right, I'm there.
Unlike a lot of my colleagues, when I do conventions, once the bell rings in the end of the day, I'm not spending my night sitting in the hotel room doing commissions. I'm having to do with colleagues. You know, I'm out there, and we're taking other people's inventory and just having the best time. And I'm on Facebook daily talking to guys like Dave Johnson, Cully Hamner, and a bunch of other cats who I'm used to eating with at conventions. I'm used to being the old man at the table and just telling stories. Lies, and serious truth. That's what it's all about.
So we got about a minute and a half left. So what are you working on now? What can people be looking for in the next year? We'll start with volume 2 of Hey Kids Comics, but what else do you got? What else is cooking?
Well, let's see. Hey Kids, number 1, Profits and Loss, the second arc will be out in May. In June, you'll see a graphic novel from Dark Horse that I finished some time back called Sunshine Patriots, which is a quasi-western that takes place in the streets of Los Angeles in 1911, featuring 2 heroes of the Rough Riders working for a Hollywood studio against the onset of the Sicilian Mafia. Times Squared 3, which will be a full volume of all three books will be out. And I'm working right now on a secret project with a writer who's a dear friend and someone I love collaborating with that we can't talk about yet, but we will be talking about soon. Kyle, thanks so much. This has been great. I've had a great
man,
time.
absolutely. This has been just a true honor for me. I called you a cult classic, a cult hero earlier, and it's true. I love cult heroes. Those are my guys. Those are the guys I want to hang out with. So when we're traveling around the road, we're eating food together.
Altman of comics. That's me, the Robert Altman of comics. Or is it the Van Morrison of comics? Or is it the Randy Newman of comics? Who knows? All right, man.
All right. We'll see. We'll have dinner. We'll have dinner hopefully soon.
With luck and the will of God. Thanks, man.
We'll see ya.
I'm out.
All right, guys. We'll be back in just about a minute with our next panel. Miss Jen is going to be talking to some fabulous indie creators about their brands and about how they are making it in that world. We will be back in just about a minute.